Good afternoon and thank you for registering for this online information session, which I trust will assist you to present an innovative project for the abatement and or sequestration of the greenhouse gases that concern us all. My name is Martin Sadler and as the Program Manager for Carbon Innovation Grants, I am pleased to be your first point of contact throughout the application process. I'm joined today by Mr. Mark Cassino, the Senior Manager of Mitigation Policy and Programs for our Department's Climate Change Division. Assisting Mark and I with our online chat facility are Ro, Branushka and Amanda, all valued members of our team engaged in the mitigation of climate issues. I commence this session by acknowledging all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the First Nation Australians and its islands. We at the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation acknowledge their ongoing intergenerational care and connection to lands and waters and pay our respect to their elders past, present and emerging. For the next 45 minutes, with the help of a few slides, you'll be presented with an overview of the program's extensive merit criteria, and Mark will walk you through the financial model template for feasibility studies. If you have any questions during or following the presentation, please post them using the chat facility and we will answer those that we can today, and those that we can't shall be taken on notice with answers posted online to our program website as soon as possible. Also, please note that as keen as I am to garner your applications, no doubt of significance to this program's objectives, and of course of substantial value to our state, we cannot answer questions that possibly circumvent the assessment process for grants. This means you need to keep your questions to a general nature and not specific to your proposed project. That will ensure equitable treatment for all applicants in a competitive grant round, none being treated more favourable than any other. Now, objectives of the program. Firstly, and most importantly, reduction of carbon emissions from heavy industry processes in Western Australia. Secondly, support of the development of innovative technologies for carbon abatement and sequestration. Also, maximisation of co-benefits for the environment and the Western Australian economy. Optionally also, an increase of the supply of carbon credits enabling heavy industry to offset residual emissions. There are two funding streams available by this program that you may choose from. The first stream is feasibility studies that support technology development to move from concept through to real-world trials. This stream has a minimum funding limit of $50,000 and a maximum limit of $500,000, and your grant must be no more than 50% of eligible project costs. The second stream is for pilot projects and capital works that support real-world pilot trials that enable technologies to scale up to full commercial-ready applications. With a minimum funding limit of $100,000 and a maximum limit of $1.5 million, your grant for this stream must be no more than 25% of eligible project costs. Now to an overview of the merit criteria to be addressed in your Smart Grants application, I invite Mark to further explain to you the criteria in respect of the reduction of emissions. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Martin. Okay, so I'm going to talk you through merit criteria 1, which is all about reducing emissions and obviously ties heavily to the program objectives and is quite critical to the grant itself. So firstly, under this criteria, I just want to note that the majority of merit criteria 1 is assessed through the financial model template, and you can find a copy of this template on the Carbon Innovation Grant website. And this is where these assessments and calculations are made. Please use, when you are completing that template, use ENGA emission factors or other evidence-based calculation methods to demonstrate emissions estimates are genuine and realistic. Now, this is quite important because what we're trying to do is provide due diligence and assurance that the projects that we're assessing and potentially awarding a grant are achieving a genuine and significant emission reduction saving. You may be aware that there is a range of claims around at the moment around greenwashing out there around emissions reduction. There's also a federal review of carbon credit units and what the integrity of those units may or may not be. So we need to make sure that we're doing our piece to do our due diligence and ensure that we have integrity in our assessments. To the components of merit criteria 1, the first is direct and indirect emission reductions. So this is where we ask you to consider your operational control boundaries and to look at the scope of emissions that your project is tackling. We do want to look at facility-based emissions that are within your operational control, not just the emissions relating to an individual industrial process, for example, because we want to see what is the scale of those emissions that you're trying to achieve. There is in terms of operational control, you're typically talking about your Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. However, there is options to include Scope 3 emissions as well if that's relevant to your project. The next component is the scale of emissions reduction relative to a baseline. So we do ask for a comparison of before and after, essentially. What are your current emissions from your industrial facility or current operations? And what will that look like after your proposed project is implemented? And that way, we, again, are looking at for that scale of emission reduction relative to that baseline, and so that we can see that the types of projects that we're looking to invest in are making a material difference to emission reduction. The third component under merit criteria 1 is the permanence of savings. Now, what we're asking you to demonstrate here is that the project will continue to reduce emissions into the longer term. And that's to ensure that we're providing a good investment through the Carbon Innovation Grant and getting the longer term outcomes and the contribution to achieving net zero emissions by 2050, which is one of the goals of the WA climate policy. In terms of permanence requirements, these may vary depending on your project type. You may need to include consideration of your future production plans and whether an increase in production in future could result in an increase in emissions. If you're looking at a sequestration project, then you'll need to look at the reliability of that sequestration, such as is it going to stay sequestered within a reservoir, or if you're looking at a land sector project, are those emissions guaranteed to stay sequestered into the longer term? If you're looking at a project where you're proposing carbon capture and use, where you're storing carbon in a used product, then you also need to be able to demonstrate that those emissions are likely to be stored in the longer term, despite the fact that that product is being used, an example being storing carbon emissions in cement. Lastly, on this page, we have the target cost of abatement. And here we ask you to demonstrate that the project aims to achieve emissions reductions at a competitive market cost. Again, we're looking for projects that have that potential for broader market uptake. So we want to see that projects have that potential to be a good investment and therefore likely to be taken up by the broader industry. The last component of merit criteria 1 is the mitigation hierarchy and the transition to net zero emissions. Here we ask you to demonstrate that emissions are being addressed across the hierarchy and that there is a plan to reach net zero. So what we want to see is that the project you're proposing is not a project in isolation, that you do have, it does fit within that broader plan. Again, because the goal of this grant is to assist industry to transition to net zero emissions, not just to undertake one-off projects to reduce emissions in the short term. When you're tackling emissions across the hierarchy, you do need to consider a range of situations. And if you're looking at a project that is at the lower end of the hierarchy, then you need to be able to demonstrate that other projects are underway. An example of this is carbon offset projects, which is at the lower end of the emission reduction hierarchy. So a carbon offset project would need to demonstrate that it's tackling residual emissions, and you have those other projects higher up the value chain that are already planned or underway to reduce emissions from the industrial site. To recap, we do provide a definition of what the mitigation hierarchy is within the Carbon Innovation Grant guidelines. But to recap here, we have at the top of the hierarchy is avoiding emissions. And that might be through ceasing a process that produces emissions or ceasing operation of an industrial site. So that might not actually be covered by the Carbon Innovation Grant, because our purpose is not to fund the closure of activities. It's about doing them in a more sustainable way. Second, we have reduce emissions, and that's typically by improving efficiency. That might include improving the efficiency of a process so it uses lower amounts of fossil fuels, or it might be energy efficiency and improving the energy efficiency of a process. Next, on the hierarchy, we have replacement, and this is where you change an industrial process to remove emissions. An example of that being replacing natural gas-based hydrogen with green hydrogen. Next is store. So carbon capture, use and storage, all the different activities there. We've already undertaken or are planning to undertake activities higher up in the hierarchy to look at improving your process efficiency and replacing fossil fuels with other sources. Those fossil fuels that you can't avoid, you can look at storing the emissions through carbon capture, use and storage. Then the last component, as I mentioned before, is offsets, which should be tackling residual emissions only and looking at approved carbon offset products and methods where that is the case. So that is merit criteria 1, a very important criteria within the overall Carbon Innovation Grant. And I'll now pass back to Martin to discuss the other merit criteria.
Thank you, Mark. Moving now to the components to be assessed for the business case that must be presented with your Smarty Grants application. There are no less than 7 important components that must be addressed. First, and quite obviously important, is the funding sought relative to your project costs. Next, funding and security of sources must be addressed. We need to be assured that you have a secure source of funding with which to complete this project. Your monetary application, that is your entity's monetary contribution, must be not less than 25% of your project cost. And your business case must also address the justification for funding. That is, your project not being business as usual or otherwise not commercially viable without government assistance. Also important in this regard is the impact of grant and consequent acceleration of sectoral change that will appear by your business case. That business case ought to also address technical feasibility and demonstration that the project you're proposing would be a good investment for the state of Western Australia. And finally, in this regard, I want to talk to the commitment that must appear by your business case to progress your project proposal further after the feasibility or pilot phase, and thereby the longer term and substantial benefits that could be realised by your proposal. The third of the merit criteria that I'd like to speak to is the components to be addressed for the ability to deliver your project proposal. Now, in that respect, technical management and capability and expertise are to be demonstrated. As to be demonstrated is the time frame for project commencement and delivery. In this respect, also relevant agreements and project partners, including their respective roles and level of involvement in one or more of heavy industry facilities, are necessary in this particular merit criteria. Also to be demonstrated is the governance structure for your project proposal with viable project milestones and performance criteria, resourcing and quality assurance, including a project risk management plan and a completed risk register template, which you will find on the program website. The department's also looking to see a path to achieving financial close and commencing project delivery upon execution of a funding agreement. Also required is a secure regulatory approval and or access permits to carry out the project. That must be demonstrated for the purpose of persuading the assessment panels that you have the ability to deliver the project proposal. Finally, in this regard, plans for insurance to cover potential liability that may result from conducting project activities must be addressed. The fourth merit criteria concerns innovation and wider adoption of your project proposal. Now, in respect of innovation, what the department is looking for is projects beyond common practice facilitating new or more efficient ways to abate emissions with new approaches to existing methods that reduce costs while overcoming other barriers to wider adoption by industry. Also in this regard, the likelihood that similar projects could be replicated at other sites or across an industry type is really quite important to us. As is our rise and scan to other technologies with a view to project technology that can be widely adopted. Finally, in this particular respect, that is the merit criteria for innovation and wider adoption, the department's looking for the potential for scalable adoption in respect of hard-to-abate emissions related to heavy industry processes, as referenced in the applicant guidelines glossary. And I would commend the references in the glossary to heavy industry facilities. There you will see a reference to the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Guidelines. You'll also see a reference to a technical report, and you will also, and finally, this third reference to the legislation that we're concerned with in this particular area of concern. Now, the regulations contain no less than 54 different applications that you ought to have a look at to see whether or not your project proposal can fit within those. If not, look to the technical report and see whether or not your application or your project proposal fits within the definition or the explanation of what heavy industry facilities are there. The fifth and final merit criteria is to be assessed is that is the project's public good. Now, the components to be assessed in that particular regard are a knowledge sharing plan demonstrating the quality and extent that a plan to build industry capacity and confirm feasibility of new technology and processes for industry-wide application is possible. Also, in respect of the merit criteria for demonstrating public good, are initiatives for industry types to decarbonise, and quite importantly, economic development through job creation, including but not limited to Aboriginal employment, and further business development, introducing new industry or business practices. Another component to demonstrate a project's public good is environmental co-benefits, and those co-benefits are to be demonstrated through reduced pollution, reduced use of raw materials, commitment to biodiversity, and climate adaptation with related resilience. Finally, a project's public good must also have regard to the objectives of the WA climate policy, and that's all about a resilient, low carbon future supporting a net zero transition. Now, how to apply for a carbon innovation grant. Applications are to be made using the Spider Grants portal, and please refer to the applicant guidelines when making a project proposal. We trust that you'll find them most useful insofar as any questions that you may have. There is a frequently asked questions section that contains a number of the questions that's been put to the department throughout this grant process. Please download and complete the financial template and risk register template to accompany your application. And note that the deadline for applications is 2 p.m. on 16 December 2022. And if you've got any query, my contact details and that of my team are to be noted at carbongrants@dua.wa.gov.au, or I'm available by telephone on 08 6364 7666. Now, it's my pleasure to hand back to Mark, who will now walk you through the financial model for that's the financial model template for a feasibility study. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Martin. Okay, so I'll just do, for those of you who weren't able to attend the first of the webinars that we ran through, I'll give a quick recap of the financial model itself. And then after this, we'll go into the feasibility study example in more detail. So to recap, the key elements of the financial model template is to capture the elements of the project, including costs and sources of funding and expected emission savings. And it's to enable that evidence-based assessment against the merit criteria in a format that can easily be compared between projects. So we do expect that we're going to receive a broad variety of projects that might receive funding through the Carbon Innovation Grant. So the attempt with this model is to provide that level playing field where we can compare and contrast between those different project types. And the last component of the financial model is to provide an overview of project timelines and deliverables as well. Now, I do want to highlight at this point that the financial model is complex. It will take you some time to complete. Please don't expect to sit down and knock it off in a couple of hours. It will take you longer than that, and you may need the assistance of someone with carbon accounting or carbon management expertise to assist you in completing this template. We don't shy away from the fact that it is complex and requires quite detailed information to complete. As I touched on earlier in the presentation, it is very important that we have the evidence base to assess projects effectively and to ensure that the projects that do receive funding are achieving significant and genuine emission reductions. To assist you with completing the model, however, we do have the case studies that provide a guide, and these are attached on the Carbon Innovation Grant website, and we've provided these webinars as well to run through those case studies and provide some more detail about how to complete the model. So the financial model itself, it's an Excel-based template, and there are 5 tabs with which you should be aware of. The first is provide some further instructions on how to complete the template. The second is the project summary tab, and here there is summary information about your project, but it's also where you'll need to insert the key assumptions that you use within your financial model. The third tab is the financial model itself, and that's where you'll provide the bulk of the information that's required to complete the template. And then there is the in-kind contributions tab. Now, this is fairly straightforward. We just ask you to record any in-kind contributions that you expect to receive for your project and that contribute towards your project's funding to be recorded in this tab. And then we have, lastly, the Carbon Innovation Grant merit criteria. This is simply some further information for you that outlines which of the merit criteria are addressed in whole or in part through the financial model template. There are separate templates for feasibility studies and pilot projects and capital work, so please make sure you're downloading the correct template for your project type. And lastly, here I'll note the colour coding that's used throughout the template. So we have a dark green colour where you're able to input values or data for your project. Then we have a light green colour for cells where there is a formula that's built in, and that provides a default calculation, but you are able to override those formulas and put in your own values. Nothing within this template is locked down or hidden. You can see all of the information that's used to build the template, and you can edit it as required to suit your project. However, if you do delete a formula, you will see a yellow highlighting that pops up to show that that formula has been deleted. And we ask that you leave that yellow highlighting in place just so that we can see how the model has been altered if you do so. On the financial model tab, there are a range of key elements that we ask you to fill in data for your project. Firstly, you have your project costs and your revenue sources. And then the core of the template is the carbon emissions and financial savings that you intend to achieve. Now, in this part of the model, it's essentially a before and after assessment. So we ask you to compare the current state and your current baseline to what you expect to achieve after the project is implemented. There are also 3 categories where you can include different sources of emissions and savings. So we have a raw materials category for emissions relating to the extraction of raw materials. Then we have an industrial processing emissions category, and then we have a sequestration category. Now, you may use one or more of these categories in defining your project and outlining all of the emissions and savings you intend to achieve. It will depend on your project type. As I've mentioned before, the focus is on Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, that is those emissions under your direct control, but you are able to look at Scope 3 emissions as well. The last component of this tab and template is the long-term costs and benefits that need to be assessed. and that includes return on investment calculations. We won't go into the pilot projects and capital works template further in this presentation. We went through the pilot projects case study in detail in the last webinar, and you can review the recording that is now uploaded onto the Carbon Innovation Grants website for that. Just to note here that the pilot projects template does include some additional requirements, a more detailed requirement around assessing emissions from construction, because in this case you are actually building something as part of the funded works. It does also look for some more detailed return on investment calculations and identifying how the Carbon Innovation Grant itself benefits the long-term return on investment. All right, so now we'll go into the feasibility case study in some detail, and I'll move to the case study itself in a second. To the case study that's provided on the website is the assessment of the feasibility of carbon capture and use from a cement kiln. In more detail, that means a feasibility study that's looking at carbon emissions capture from a cement and lime factory and conversion of those captured emissions into a solid material that then can be incorporated into cement products. Now, this is known as carbon capture and use, or CCUS. I want to note at this point that all case study numbers are fictional and may not be represent a real-world scenario in terms of potential emissions reduction and financial costs or savings. The case study is only designed as an example of how to use the financial model template and should not be used as a basis for a grant application. So please don't take the numbers in any way as meaningful or in any way as an identity of identifying what sort of projects might actually receive funding. Simply there as a guide as to how to use the template. All right, so bear with me a second. I'll switch over now to looking at the financial model case study. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see this. Please note in the chat if you're finding it hard to see what's on the screen. But what I'm sharing now is the feasibility case study. And we're on the first tab, which is the instructions for how to use the template. So we won't go into that in detail here. You can read that at your leisure. I'll just note the colour coding that I mentioned before that's used throughout the template. Next, we'll move to the project summary for the case study, and we'll scroll down to table 4, which is your project assumptions. And this is where you need to enter the key assumptions that are used in your financial model. The first, if you can please include an intended start date for your project and the project life, so we can gain a feel for whether the project is fitting within the timeframes required for the grant. There's also an option here to include your threshold return rate for investment, and this little red tab here provides a more detailed definition of what's required for this category. Further down, we've got a range of different assumptions that are used to calculate carbon emissions and financial savings for your project. We'll take an example here of mobile plant diesel use, and across this line here, line 47, and this is an emission factor for use of diesel, which converts kilolitres of diesel into tonnes of CO2. And we can see here that that's taken from table 4 of the ENGA account factors for 2021. Similarly, further down, we have a cost for diesel, which is in dollars per kilolitre, and that is used to calculate the costs for using diesel in your project or in your current operation. Sorry. The last assumption here I'll note in detail at this point is the production unit, or PU, and that's something that each project will need to nominate and will be project dependent. For this case study example, PU is the tonnes of cement produced per year. And down here on the last line, we can see the current production volume per annum, which is nominated as 50,000 tonnes of cement that is produced from the factory in any given year. The last thing I'll note on this table before we move on is the source or reasoning behind value. So in this, this is something you'll see throughout the financial model, and this is where we ask you to enter the justification for the assumptions and the data that you input into the model. In some cases, such as the examples I've just provided, you might be able to refer very briefly to a published emission factor in the ENGA accounts. But in other cases, you'll need to attach evidence, and you would attach that through Smarty grants as part of your application. And if you do that, please reference the information very clearly so we can find the detail around those assumptions. So you might want to reference both the page number and the attachment number and name, so we can very clearly find that evidence when we're making our assessment of the application. We'll now move to the core of the model, the financial model itself, and we have table 1, which is your project costs. So here we ask you to enter all of the relevant costs that relate to your proposed project. And this will sum up to your total project costs. You can also here, in percentage of eligibility, nominate whether there are any ineligible costs that are part of your project. And within the instructions on the first tab are definitions of what sources of expenditure or costs are eligible or ineligible for the grant. Next, we move to table 2, which is your project funding. And here you need to nominate all of the sources of funding that you need to pay for your project costs. And there is a check that will be done through these tables to make sure that you have sufficient funding to cover all of your project costs. I'll note here that the in-kind contributions are not highlighted in green for you to complete. That's because you should enter any in-kind contributions on the in-kind contributions tab, and then they will automatically show up here. As part of your sources of funding, you do need to nominate how much funding you're seeking from the Carbon Innovation Grant. And again, there'll be an automated check that is done to confirm the amount of funding you're seeking is within the grant guideline requirements. The next table we have is table 3, and this is all about what funds are spent on. Here we ask you to nominate milestones for your project, and please include a project completion milestone to show the end of your project. And then you need to outline all of the sources of expenditure or costs that will be allocated to each milestone. Now, there are checks again to make sure the costs that you outline here line up with table 1 so that there's no gap in the total costs for the project. And lastly, in this table, I will note line 48, which is where we ask you to just enter the expected number of months each milestone will take to complete. And again, there'll be a check to make sure that that fits within the grant guideline requirements. Okay, now we'll move down to item 4, which is your projected emissions and costs. Now, this is the core of the model and also the most complex component. To start with, as I mentioned in the slides, you'll see that the heart of it is essentially a before and after calculation. We have our baseline to define what are the emissions that are occurring now from your industrial facility or operations, and what are the emissions that are intended to occur after full-scale deployment of your project. Now, this is important to note for feasibility projects. Obviously, you're not planning on building anything significant as part of the feasibility study itself. So what we're looking for is for you to nominate your estimates at this point, of what sort of emissions and savings you expect to achieve if you were able to deploy your proposed project at full scale. So this is that before and after calculation, and we do ask you to do that assessment, and then your feasibility study would then be proving up and testing the figures and numbers that you're including in the model at this point. I'll also note the three categories here that I mentioned in the slides. So we have the raw materials category for emissions associated with the extraction of raw materials, emissions associated with industrial processes, and then sequestration as the third item, where you can include sources of emissions and savings if you wish. In terms of how this particular part of the model works, I'll also show you that the first component is all about carbon emission sources here. And then down below, we have carbon sinks. And the way this table is designed, any carbon sinks you record are automatically deducted from your emissions to show you your net emissions at the bottom of the table down here. Okay, now we'll look into the detail of what's been included. So in your baseline or current situation, we have some emissions associated with diesel use. Now, we have some diesel use that's used in extraction of raw materials from quarrying, and then some that's used within the industrial plant itself. And the way the default template works is that you input your volume of diesel use in the dark green cells, and then there is a formula that automatically calculates the tonnes of emissions that are produced on an annual basis. Now, this will tie to the assumption that I referenced in the project summary tab, which converts kilolitres of diesel fuel per year into tonnes of carbon emissions per year. And likewise, the assumption in the project summary for the cost of diesel per kilolitre is another formula here that automatically calculates the annual cost of diesel use per year from that 50 kilolitres a year of diesel use that has been nominated. Scrolling further down for this particular project, we have emissions associated with that are process emissions, and they're described over here as the emissions from heating limestone. And that is an emission factor direct calculation. Next, down here, the major source of emissions for this particular facility is natural gas use, and it's the natural gas use that's used to heat the limestone in the cement making process. So they're all your current emissions that are listed within this case study for feasibility. When we move over to the case for after full-scale deployment, and if we remember, this is a carbon capture and use proposal. So the diesel use remains the same. There's no proposal to reduce those emissions as part of this project. Similarly, there are the emissions from the heating of limestone that still remain, and the natural gas use that still remains. However, down here, we now have 77,000 tonnes of carbon emissions that's proposed to be captured per year from the industrial process and converted into a solid product that's incorporated into cement. So there is no default formula or calculation with carbon capture and use type projects. Every project would be very bespoke to the individual facility and individual project. So if this was a real project, you would need to attach more detailed evidence and justification of why you thought that volume of carbon emissions could be stored and captured. So that would need to be an attachment to your application. The next component here, we see that there is $50,000 of annual operating costs for the carbon capture and use plant. The last component that is nominated here is the purchase of 2,000 carbon credits per annum. Now, these 2,000 carbon credits are used to offset the diesel emissions that are unavoidable and can't be captured further up in the table, and also to ensure that you purchase sufficient carbon credits to achieve a carbon neutral product. And those carbon credits cost $60,000 per year to purchase. Now, I will note here that you can see that the 2,000 carbon credits is a fixed value, and that's highlighted yellow because the default formula has been deleted. And we've done that on purpose to show you how this template works. The last component of this table, you'll see that there is a nominated new source of revenue from selling carbon neutral cement at a premium. And so that's how this business case works. There are some additional costs with the carbon capture and use, but from a financial perspective, that's able to be offset by a new revenue source. So further down here, you will see there's a summary table that summarises the key information from this particular project. Is proposing to capture 79,000 tonnes of carbon emissions per year if it was deployed at full scale. And that is slightly more than 100% of current emissions because you're buying those extra credits to ensure you're achieving carbon neutrality. And there is a net revenue or improvement in income of $140,000 per year. Okay, we'll next move down to table 5, which is about the change in abatement over time. And here we're looking at one of the tests of permanence. So we ask you to forecast what future volumes of production would look like and whether that might result in an increase in the carbon emissions that are generated from your project. Now, in this example, you'll see that carbon emissions remain fixed. There is no increase in carbon emissions. And that's because there's a justification at the end that the carbon capture and use plant can be scaled up with any increase in production. Now, if this was a real scenario and a real application, you would need to again justify that with further evidence attached to your application. The last component of this model is viability and impact. So in this table, we ask you to enter the capital cost for full scale if you were to build the carbon capture and use plant at full scale, and what that production life of that asset would be. And then some further financial figures around your discount rate and annual price escalation rate. And again, you'll see the red tabs here that provide you with further definitions around what those items are. Lastly, we ask you to estimate what is the annual production unit volume within WA for your industry type. So this enables a calculation or an estimate of the emission reduction that could be achieved if your technology was adopted across your entire industry type in Western Australia. So that's getting that idea of what is the scale of abatement that can be achieved. The last item we ask you to enter here is estimated emissions from construction if you were to build the project at full scale. And that would be a very high level estimate for a feasibility study, of course, but it's just making sure that the emissions during construction are not likely to outweigh the project benefits from carbon emission savings. So below this, there are automated calculations for lifetime emissions saved from the project and the potential annual WA industry savings that could be achieved if this technology was deployed across your industry type. Then lastly, we have another automated table that looks at your financial return on investment. And you can see here that the project is estimated to have a positive net present value and an internal rate of return that exceeds your threshold rate of return, which was nominated as 5% in the project summary. So these are indicators that the project is a sound investment. So that's the end of the model. You will see below are the detailed calculations that sit behind the net present value and internal rate of return calculations. You don't need to do anything with those calculations, but they're there for you to see, so you can see how they're calculated. Right, I'll very quickly jump back to the project summary tab, and we'll go to the top, and we have a section on validation. And because this model is now completed, you can see that there are a range of checks here to make sure your project aligns with the grant guidelines and that it's looking like it's financially viable. In table 2 as well, you have your project summary, and this provides a summary of the key items within your project, so you can check that these match your expectations of what you've inputted into the financial model itself. So that brings us to the end of the presentation and an outline of the feasibility study, and we'll now move to questions, and please, enter your questions into the chat.
And please note that this session is being recorded and will be posted online following the conclusion of the session today at some stage in the not too distant future. Thank you. Hand up.
Someone's asking, I think.
Yeah.
I saw questions.
I'll read it up. Question. For the production unit, what should be listed for sequestration technologies that address multiple emitter types?
Sure, that's a good question. We are looking for industry partners that you would have to have as part of your application. So if whoever your main industry partner is, would probably be a good start. What we're looking for is demonstration against industrial facilities. So look, if you've got multiple potential project partners, I would look at the ones that are your most firm project partners first and include those. You might need, if you've got multiple major project partners that you're looking to work with and that are part of your application, you might actually need to include more than one version of the case study, of the template to demonstrate how that's benefiting those individual industries. And that ties back to the fact as well that what we're looking for here is evidence of how if you're looking at a sequestration project, what are the approaches to reducing emissions across the emission reduction hierarchy, and that there is a plan to transition to net zero emissions. So you do need those firm project partners on board, and they're the ones you should talk about in your application. If you are wanting to highlight the potential benefits to a range of industries, you can do that as well through your application documents. But yeah, focus on your core project partners in the template would be my advice.
If the applicant is already an industrial business, can the applicant be the industrial partner and a sole applicant?
Certainly you can, yeah, just trying to understand the question here. If you're an industrial business, you can be the lead on an application, absolutely. You can be the partner on an application if, for example, you might have a consultancy or some other specialist organisation that is taking the lead on completing the application. You could be the partner, but you could definitely be the sole applicant. You don't have to have other partners on board if you're an industrial business.
Thank you, Mark. Is there a list of production unit types to choose from?
No, that's entirely up to you. So you can nominate what your production unit is, and that's to suit your operations. So yeah, that really is up to you.
Thank you. Would applicants with matching funds held as cash at a bank be considered more competitive than those with funds available by legal agreement upon award of grant?
So the answer to that is no. There is there is no difference between the two of them. What we're looking for, there isn't a minimum contribution that an applicant needs to make to a project from your own funds, but that can be cash at bank or funds that are awarded through a legal agreement or a loan or the like.
The monetary contribution is 25%.
Okay, is there any other questions? We are able to stay around and answer a few more. Alternatively, we will be sending out a short survey after the end of this webinar to get your views on the information and how useful it was, and whether you would like any further webinars going into any particular details of the grant. So, but I'm also happy to receive those questions here, or suggestions rather, if you have ideas for future webinars. Okay, Martin, I'll pass it over to you to wrap up. Looks like.
Well, thank you very much for all of you who have registered today. If there are further questions that haven't occurred to you right now, please feel free to either email them. Just a moment, we do have one more question. Your technology partner is foreign. Will our application be regarded less for light?
No. In short, no. We are looking for investment in Western Australia. So if you're planning on building something outside of Western Australia, that would be a problem. But as long as that technology is being brought into the country and being used within Western Australia, then that's exactly what we're looking for in some cases, is the introduction of new technology and testing it and trialling it here. So definitely eligible. So yeah, as I say, yeah, located in Western Australia, so that should not be a problem.
That is sites in Western Australia. Are there any further questions that we can assist you with? Please note that, and I'm reiterating what I've said earlier, that the focus of this program is looking at abatement of whether and possibly sequestration of emissions from industrial processes. And that I can't stress how important that is, and the reason for that is, of course, that in Western Australia, 60% of our greenhouse gas emissions are consequent upon industrial processes. So that's what we're looking to address. Thank you. Any further questions in that or any other respects? No, there have been no more questions at this time. I propose to close this session, but as I've indicated earlier, should you have any further questions, we're available by email, or I'm available by email, or alternatively by telephone. And we look forward to your applications in due course. But please note that the applications close at 2 p.m. which is the equivalent of Western Standard Time on the 16th of December. 5 p.m. Eastern. 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Western Standard Time, on the 16th of December 2022. Thank you very much. And your subscription to the Carbon Innovation Grants Program has been most appreciated. Thank you once again.
How long is the assessment process?
The assessment process, we're hoping will be resolved by May or June of next year, but of course that is something that we can't necessarily give you any guarantee in respect of. The final decision in respect of whether a grant is or an application is going to be successful for a grant lies with the Minister for Climate Action, and therefore once the application has been received, evaluated by an officer assessment panel, and then put before an executive assessment panel for recommendations to the Minister, then we will have to wait on the Minister's final decision. Does that answer that question? Thank you very much. No further questions arising. I now propose to close the session, and once again, I thank you for your online attendance.